have taken time, although in retrospect, this approach would have taken far less time, less money, and fewer destroyed lives and livelihoods than what we really did. A conservative approach would have saved trillions of dollars. It would have educated Americans on the rule of law and the Constitution rather than blinding them to it. And a conservative approach, because it cares about history and culture and community, would have ensured that Americans more deeply understood terrorism and how to really prevent it. Instead, we are repeatedly lied to by our government on everything, but particularly on the lack of success, cost, the high cost, and the increased risk of our ongoing and endless war on terror. Rahm Emanuel, you know him, right, has famously said, you never want to let a crisis go to waste, and he is right from a government standpoint. I hope that from a conservative's perspective, Rahm's words are an abomination. But in fact, looking at the policies of the Bush and Cheney administration regarding terrorism, with Obama continuing them enthusiastically, I am beginning to have doubts as to whether conservatives in this country really understand what it means to be a conservative. Had our government not seized the opportunity that the 9/11 crisis presented, and had the Bush administration spent that political capital on a serious legal and criminal approach to catching and punishing the 9/11 terrorists, by now, almost 9 years later, in the very worst case scenario, we would be in the same place as we are today. Lots of bad guys picked up, some convicted in trials, others held with trials pending. Certainly, many people would have been released, as we have done already with a good number of those who had been held without charge or evidence in Guantanamo. Best case, this whole episode would be behind us, and the money not spent on security might have gone to reduce the deficit or to support tax cuts. Had we taken the conservative fork in the road back in 2001, we would not have enraged other nations, insulted entire cultures, violated our own Constitution, and sacrificed on a bloody altar what we like to put forth as American honor. We would be living in a world where our $1.4+ trillion debt ceiling could be reduced, not raised. We would be living in a world without an overrun defense and intelligence structure, with no blurring of lines between civilian law enforcement and the military. We would be living in a world where, having not killed women and children, having not interfered with the domestic politics and trade policies of third world countries and faraway places, and having not destroyed our one-time reputation as a free nation, we would be clearly safer from terror aimed against us. But the United States is led by a media and power elite that is in fact not conservative. It is instead vested in doing exactly what it has been doing, growing in power and increasing its take from the national till. For these agencies, the war on terror is working just fine. How might we, as conservatives today, really begin to fight terrorism? First, get a Secretary of State who speaks for the Founding Fathers' preferred policy of free trade with all and entangling alliances with none. Second, if a Secretary of War is required, appoint one who will make his sole mission the security of the United States rather than the security and continued expansion of the defense industrial establishment. Third, conservatives of all people have the responsibility to understand both rule of law and to understand our own American history, both the good and the bad, and to keep the light of freedom burning at home. This means we have to be leading the charge at home to reduce our illegal empire abroad for reasons both financial and constitutional. Instead, of course, the Republican Party has become identified with big government, empire, excess spending, and overpriced and counterproductive defense strategy. As the American people wake up to this reality, they will naturally reject the philosophy that is behind the modern GOP approach. If the GOP intends to remain relevant, it must deliver. The nearly decade-long experiment in government growth called the war on terror has been a cruel joke that history will rightfully blame on the Republican Party. It's not working, and conservatives, as well as libertarians and independents and Democrats, can all see that. But only old-style conservatives and libertarians are truly in a position to offer a reasonable alternative, and that alternative is to energize real conservatism in our defensive strategy and foreign affairs, and to rediscover the sound advice of Sun Tzu, von Clausewitz, and more than ever, our founding fathers.
He mentioned the Washington elite in his talk, but I think it's important to note that not everybody in it has bought into preemptive and perpetual war. And our next speaker is a case in point. Bruce Fein is the former Associate Deputy Attorney General in the Reagan administration. He's now president of the American Freedom Agenda and author of the forthcoming Campaign for Liberty published The American Empire Before the Fall. Please welcome Bruce Fein.
As Robert Goodloe Harper would have said, millions for defense, not 1 cent for preemptive war and building empire. Woo! I want to speak today about the problem that has arisen in the United States, where it's the best of time for empire, the worst of time for the American Republic. Because it didn't just begin with 9/11, all that accentuated it. In fact, it goes back to the time when we began to lose our bearings from what the Founding Fathers intended the vision of the Republic to be. First with the Mexican-American War, Manifest Destiny, lying about Mexican attacks on the United States, the same lies about the sinking of the Maine that Admiral Rickover discredited years later, the lies that Woodrow Wilson told about the Lusitania, there are lies that Franklin Roosevelt told about purported Nazi submarine attacks on U.S. vessels that were contrived to get us into war. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and before that, remember Harry Truman's police action in Korea, some police action, lied to the Senate that when we entered the UN, he would ask the Senate and the House for an authorization for war, but he decided he'd forget that when it came to Korea. The Gulf of Tonkin we already mentioned, and we can go on and on, the most recent with regard to post 9/11 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, maybe soon into Iran, Yemen, or otherwise. What I'd like to explain is what previous speakers have elaborated on, how much we have turned the Constitution and the Republic on its head. The first, it's always amusing to me to hear people who claim they're the strongest constitutionalists say we've got to take the military into all corners of the globe, maybe even interplanetary, intergalactic connection. Because, wait a minute, we have, what's the doctrine? The 1/1,000,000% doctrine. If there's 1/1,000,000%, it's true, you gotta act on, it's the gospel. Maybe plotting in Mars, we gotta go there with NASA, right? And that idea has infected the United States, because if you're looking for no-risk life, there's no liberty and no freedom. It's what the Founding Fathers understood. You have to have risk. It does not mean senseless risk, but you have to take some risk. No one can stand up, put their hand on a Bible or a Quran and say, I'm incapable of evil. So when you make up concocted fears, well, maybe they're plotting someplace, you can justify arresting and killing anybody. And indeed, that is the legal framework we're operating under now. Let me explain that first to justify why we need to be, maybe alarmed is too strong, but I don't think so. What is the legal architecture today? The war on terror, one, is permanent, because you cannot eliminate a tactic. There's no Tokyo Bay surrender, there's no Lee to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, nothing. The first time in the history of the world that war by definition is permanent. Now there's also another feature that's unique. Because a tactic can be used anywhere, the battlefield is now everywhere on the planet, including right in this room. What does that mean in terms of law? The president can use military force, he can impose military law on a battlefield. Indeed, that was the theory of the executive branch's idea that after 9/11, FISA, all the laws that regulated ordinary civilian life had no application, because we're all on a battlefield. You don't need judicial warrants, the military go, open anybody's home, all the limitations that apply in civilian life are now gone.